Hello, I'm Nick, and this is Today in Philosophy of History for Tuesday, the 9th of January, 2024. It is the 127th anniversary of the birth of Karl Löwith, who was born in Munich on this date in 1897. I think it's clear that Löwith's most influential work is Meaning in History, the Theological Implications of the Philosophy of History, which we can take as a skeptical look at philosophies of history, according to which they are essentially bastardized expressions of traditional Christian theology. Löwith says he will use the term philosophy of history to mean, quote, a systematic interpretation of universal history in accordance with a principle by which historical events and successions are unified and directed toward an ultimate meaning. Taken in this sense, philosophy of history is, however, entirely dependent on theology of history, in particular on the theological concept of history as a history of fulfillment and salvation. But then philosophy of history cannot be a science, for how could one verify the belief in salvation on scientific grounds? The absence of such a scientific basis and, at the same time, the quest for it, caused modern philosophers and even theologians like Troeltsch to reject the pre-scientific treatment of history altogether, while accepting in principle the empirical method of Voltaire. Arguing that the philosophy of history from Augustine to Bossuet does not present a theory of real history in its finitude, wealth, and mobility, but only a doctrine of history on the basis of revelation and faith, they drew the conclusion that the theological interpretation of history, or 1400 years of Western thought, is a negligible affair. Against this common opinion that proper historical thinking begins only in modern times, with the 18th century, the following outline aims to show that philosophy of history originates with the Hebrew and Christian faith in a fulfillment, and that it ends with the secularization of its eschatological pattern, unquote. If we read between the lines of this statement of what he's going to call philosophy of history, it still leaves room for philosophies of history that skirt the boundaries of what he sees as an imposition of a theological template on philosophical thought. So, for example, if you had he specifies universal history. So if you had a systematic interpretation of regional history, that might not necessarily be a problem from his point of view. Or if events and successions are not unified and not directed to an ultimate meaning, or perhaps events and successions are unified and directed toward a meaning that falls short of the ultimate. So there's still some spaces left, some interstices in this definition in which philosophy of history could hang on. But that's not how Löwith has been read. But I will return to this later. Clearly, Löwith is concerned with the fundamental question of the meaning of history, which some scholars, some philosophers of history don't even want to touch that anymore. And some people, it remains the focus of their interest. Löwith's view on meaning in history, I will quote from Meaning in History, quote, there would be no search for the meaning of history if its meaning were manifest in historical events. It is the very absence of meaning in the events themselves that motivates the quest, unquote. So we can see for Löwith, there was no intrinsic meaning in historical events. You could easily even say that meaning in history is, for Löwith, what the philosopher W.B. Galley called an essentially contested concept. And as a contested concept, there's different ways that we can fill it out. So Löwith locates the origin of the concept in theology, and from this he derives a principled rejection of philosophy of history, or you could say all philosophies of history up to his time, which seemed illegitimate. And in so doing them, he's giving us a non-philosophy of history. He's saying you can't really formulate a legitimate philosophy of history that is not a counterfeit meaning borrowed from Christian theology. And so what remains after you drain all the meaning out of history, and it seems for Löwith, very little or maybe nothing remains, and philosophy of history is an illegitimate exercise. And there's an interesting parallel here with what Eric Voegelin called ersatz religions and Bertrand Russell called surrogate religions. Others have called them political religions, like nationalism and communism. Those things which have in later history substituted for the role that religion has played in traditional societies, strikes them as an illegitimate expression. One could say then that for Löwith, philosophy of history is an ersatz philosophy. It's not the real thing. And in tracing philosophy of history to its theological origins, you find this interesting set of circumstances that almost all of our traditions in philosophy come from ancient Greece. But philosophy of history originates in St. Augustine. So we're talking several centuries into the Common Era that Augustine wrote The City of God as a response to the sack of Rome in 410 AD. There are some scholars who have argued that Augustine's City of God is not a philosophy of history. Of course, it's a big book. There's a lot in it. There are long sections on demonology and Roman history, but there are also some chapters that are very, to me at least, clearly philosophy of history. And this is where philosophy begins in the Western tradition, not in the ancient world like metaphysics and epistemology, but in the late antique and or early medieval world, as you prefer to say. So if philosophy of history originates in this providential conception of history we find in writers like St. Augustine and his follower Orosius, it's no surprise that this tradition was secularized as philosophy went forward, because there's no other way to go. If philosophy of history originates in this theological understanding of history we find in Augustine, as philosophy develops and goes forward, and especially as it passes through the Enlightenment in the 18th century, of course, it's going to secularize those concepts. There's really no other way for the discipline to develop. But we have to be careful what we mean by secularization, because it has different meaning in different contexts. So, for example, there's a very common meaning of secularization in sociology. The Encyclopedia of Sociology, 2nd edition, defines it like this, quote, "Secularization is the process by which the sacred gives way to the secular, whether in matters of personal faith, institutional practice, and political power. It involves a transition in which things once revered become ordinary, the sanctified becomes mundane, and the otherworldly loses its prefix," unquote. That sounds a lot like Max Weber's I can't remember the term now. The disenchantment of the world, that's it. So there's and Weber, of course, is one of the sources of sociology. So you can see that this is wrapped up in the origins of whether we call it secularization or disenchantment. This is wrapped up in the origins of modern thinking about social formations, as it were. This meaning of secularization is similar to, but it's a little bit distinct from the meaning that Löwith is giving to it. We could say that Löwith's conception of secularization is a special case, a limited case of the sociological conception of secularization, but we can also say that it's a reductive concept of secularization, where, according to which X is nothing but a secularized Y. So philosophy of history is nothing but a theology of history, or salvation history dressed up in secular clothing. And that makes modernity essentially illegitimate. There has been a backlash against both conceptions of secularization. Secularization thesis was very strong in sociology in the middle of the 20th century. In the later part of the 20th century, when religious fundamentalist movements gained ground in many places in the world, there were many sociologists who came to question the apparent inevitability of the secularization of societies, and that debate continues in sociology. And on the philosophical side, it became what has come to be called the Löwith-Blumenberg debate. And here is from a paper by Jean-Claude Monod, Heaven on Earth, the Löwith-Blumenberg debate. He talks about the origins of this. Quote, "We know that the discussion has started as a public debate during the conference of 1962 organized in Munster about the idea of progress. There, Löwith gave a famous lecture, The Progress as Fatality. Blumenberg, still young and unknown, for the first time launched his thesis that secularization was a category of historical illegitimacy and applied it to Löwith's book, Meaning in History. Blumenberg's thesis comes down to the assertion that secularization may not be used to discard all modern achievements as merely illegitimate transfers of theological concepts to a more worldly sphere. It is, so to speak, illegitimate to consider secularization as a category of illegitimacy, unquote. So here I'm going to quote a little bit from Blumenberg's. He gave a paper at the 1962 conference, then he wrote the big book, The Legitimacy of the Modern Age. And here is what he said about Löwith. Quote, among the propositions that in the second generation can already be described as simply as well known is the thesis that modern historical consciousness is derived from the secularization of the Christian idea of the salvation story, and more particularly of providence and eschatological finitude. Karl Löwith's important book, Meaning in History, The Theological Implications of Philosophy of History, has had a protracted dogmatizing effect in Germany since its first appearance in 1949. Löwith takes German idealism's conception of its historical position and achievement as an objective thesis about the genesis of the modern concept of history. For Löwith, Hegel's theory of the suspension and carrying forward of the Christian and Reformation phase of history and the underlying structure of the modern spiritual and political world, especially in its constitutive consciousness of subjective freedom, degraded sacred history to the level of secular history and exalted the latter to the level of the first. If the historical process were the self-realization of reason, as it was for Hegel, then according to its immanent logic, what presents itself externally as the discontinuity and secularization of the world would have to possess internal continuity. Secularization would then be the process that brought theological prehistory to its logically necessary transformation and its final form. There is a large literature on the Löwith-Blumenberg debate, so I won't try to review that, but it's a very interesting discussion of modernity and progress, because it's more than just about the origins of the philosophy of history. In fact, in Löwith, it's more tightly constrained within the question of the philosophy of history, but in Blumenberg and in the consequent debate, it becomes essentially about modernity and progress. And we can see a close relationship here to Eric Voegelin's warning, don't immanentize the eschaton. So he was another perspective of projecting the transcendental within the immanent. And Löwith in his later years turned to what I would call a form of naturalism in his later essays on the philosophy of history. So he did not abandon his critique of philosophy of history based on these theological templates. And so his later thought can be considered a continued repudiation of transcendental meaning in history. And he sought to treat the immanent as the immanent, and again, to quote Voegelin's phrase, to not to immanentize the eschaton, and not to eschatologize the immanent. One, you could say those are contrary but complementary propositions. And we have the Voegelin version, but I haven't heard of anybody asserting the other side of it. Don't transcendentalize the immanent. But each implies the other to a certain extent. So earlier, when I was talking about the ellipses left within the concept of philosophy of history that Löwith outlined early in his book on Meaning in History, he sort of takes up some of those. He finds a philosophy that fits into those ellipses, that doesn't involve a transcendental meaning, and naturalizes history insofar as that's possible. Although there's a little bit of duality that still remains there in Löwith's later writings. Zachary Riebeling, in a 2021 paper, the trauma delegitimized Karl Löwith and the cosmic view of history, attributes to Löwith what he calls a cosmic view of history. And here is a quote from the paper. Quote, "To rediscover this non-human dimension of meaning, according to Löwith, we must fundamentally reconsider our being in the world, thinking against an orientation that places humanity at the center and weighs all occurrences by its measure. As this orientation derives from doctrine of salvation developed within the Judeo-Christian tradition, Löwith steered towards its familiar foil and companion, Greek philosophy. Löwith wrote in 1953, the Greeks did not inquire expectantly and hopefully after the meaning of history, but after the omnipresent logos of physis. Attunement to the logos of physis, to the animating reason of nature, leads not into a quest for eschatological fulfillment, as the chimerical search for meaning in history does, for what is eternally of itself cannot be fulfilled. Instead, it makes possible an appreciation of the eternal order and beauty of the cosmos," unquote. I was very interested to find that in this paper, Riebeling cites David Christian and the tradition of contemporary historiography known as Big History, because it very much sounds like what Löwith is writing later on sounds like contextualizing human history within cosmological history, which is essentially part of the task of big history, although Riebeling finds the big history tradition wanting. So it's not precisely the same, but you can see, you can hear when you read some of these later papers of Löwith, a lot of things that are very familiar, that sound very much like, Carl Sagan musing on the smallness of humanity in the cosmos. And you can find that in Löwith, whether people like Sagan or people that Sagan read picked this up out of Löwith and he was the source of it. That would be interesting to find out. I don't know if that was the case. Richard Wolin, who called Löwith one of Heidegger's children, along with Hannah Arendt, Hans Jonas, and Herbert Marcuse, attributed a Stoic detachment to Löwith. But, quote, "The Stoic standpoint venerated by Löwith has been overwhelmed by modern intellectual tendencies," unquote. I don't think that Löwith would agree with that, but I think there is a essential solidarity of Stoicism and naturalism. In ancient Stoicism, there's a lot of religious rhetoric and a lot of talk of piety, but it still is an essentially naturalistic cosmos that we can, when we read the ancient Roman writers, they sound to us like contemporaries. They're thinking in the same terms, the same practical terms of the world, which we could, if we extrapolate that beyond the immediately practical, it becomes a naturalistic conception of the world. So I think there follows a kind of naturalism. And, the Romans had a large cosmopolitan civilization like we today have a large cosmopolitan civilization. And that cosmopolitanism tends toward naturalism. And one way to cope with the naturalism is to adopt a Stoic standpoint of detachment, as Wolin attributes to Löwith. So I'm going to give a final quote. This is a collection of Löwith, some of his, not all of them, but some of his later papers, Nature, History, and Existentialism, in which we catch some of this naturalism and the continued skepticism of transcendental meanings of history. Quote, "As we noted above, progress is only possible in a time that is essentially oriented toward the future. There is neither development nor progress in an everlasting present. In contrast to the classical and literal sense of the word history, however, it is characteristic of the modern historical consciousness that it is thoroughly drenched by the sense of the future and in consequence lives both in fear and hope. The will to progress is kept alive by expectations for the future. The decisive question, therefore, in regard to our being as it exists in the future is whether the time of the world is perpetual and everlasting time in contrast to the finite and mortal time of man. It is difficult to see how we could conceive of finite time if we exclude the possibility of an eternal time. Nevertheless, the idea of progress would lose the significance it has for us if there were something like an everlasting universal time in which new things are continually created and old things pass away. The gravity and immense significance of the problem of progress today springs precisely from the fact that we know of nothing that lasts forever, unquote. As I said, there's a lot in these essays by Löwith after he wrote Meaning in History that have a very familiar sound. The largeness of the vastness of the cosmos, the smallness of man, the pointlessness of our hopes and fears, which is also a theme we find in Lucretius. Lucretius criticized traditional beliefs because he thought that people were making their lives worse through the fear that he saw as the origin of religion. And this debate on progress and modernity continues, not necessarily explicitly referencing Löwith, but in terms that are clearly derived from his work. So he shaped, from the middle of the 20th century to today, he's shaped philosophy of history in a very profound way. So on this day, we say, happy birthday, Karl Löwith, and I thank you for listening.